You're listening to The Creative Imposter, episode 121. He told me to open the door to the treatment room, and when I did, I was greeted by the flickering of candlelight, fresh red rose petals sprinkled across the massage table, and a thermos of steamy chai with 2 clean cups was waiting for us. Welcome to The Creative Imposter. I'm Andrea Klunder, and we'll get back to rose petals and chai in a moment. But I realized something, and that is that it has been a while since I sat down with you, just you and me. In fact, episode 110, way back in July 2020, we were in the midst of our series on creative pandemic pivots and had not yet started our series on travel stories or our current series on not your typical self-care. And by the way, on that episode 110, I mentioned that I had been interviewed for a podcast called Bump in the Road with Pat Wetzel. That interview is actually out, and we will link it up for you in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/121. In those very same show notes, which you can easily get to in the episode description in your podcast app, you will find an invitation and link to join the Creative Imposter Collective, hosted on Mighty Networks. It's a totally free group where we can stay connected between podcast episodes, where I'll be sharing some questions and prompts for deeper reflections on our upcoming episodes. Also, you will find an invitation for you if you are a podcaster with at least 6 months podcasting experience to join me in our exclusive Podcast Envy Pro Pod, where we will collectively get down to the business of growing and sustaining the craft and culture of your show. Membership begins January 2021, so don't delay. Okay. Now, back to travel stories and not your typical self-care. It came to my attention recently that I had not recorded my own travel story to share with you, though I had these little asides that I kind of peppered throughout the other episodes. I had not shared a proper, full-length travel story. And while I have been recording these conversations for you with amazing guests, a professional network that I am a part of called Pause on the Play, facilitated by DEI coach Erica Courdae. And if you don't know what DEI is, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and visibility consultant India Jackson. They gave us a theme for the month of November, which was wellness. Perfect timing. And then one day, India posted the following prompt in the group. What's the most adventurous or uncomfortable thing you've tried in support of your well-being? What were your takeaways? Now, wellness, well-being, self-care, that was the industry that I was in and ultimately feel like I failed in for more than 5 years. Between yoga, meditation, therapeutic bodywork, Reiki, essential oils, tarot, acupuncture, sound healing, botanical skincare, really, I've tried a lot of things. And they have often put me in uncomfortable positions. But the word adventurous felt different. It immediately brought to mind a risk. More accurately, a series of risks that I took for my 34th birthday in 2012. Oh my God, I cannot even believe it was that long ago. Now, I posted a response to that prompt in their Mighty Network, and India asked me if I had yet recorded a podcast episode about that experience. And I was surprised to look back over my catalog of The Creative Imposter from the past 5 years to discover that I never really had talked about it. Maybe I had mentioned it once or twice, but now that I have crafted that story on virtual paper, I see why I hadn't shared it. I'm actually feeling pretty vulnerable right now sharing it with you. I think it's because I have some regrets from this time in my life and from this story in particular. So here goes. It started in Joshua Tree, California. I was attending a yoga and music festival called Bhakti Fest in the desert. I was there so many miles from my failing yoga studio business in Chicago by grace and hard work. I volunteered backstage in exchange for my ticket and was camping in a tent borrowed from a friend. At the end of one sweaty vinyasa flow class that featured live music and mantra chanting, yoga and singing at the same time, bliss, and consequently the style of yoga that I teach now. Anyway, at the end of the class, as I lay there on my yoga mat in a pool of my own sticky sweat, the teacher, someone I deeply respected and admired, announced that he had a few spots left in his upcoming 14-day retreat to India. It was merely 8 weeks away in my birthday month of November, and when he said it, my stomach flip-flopped. Then I heard a distinct voice in my head, didn't sound like my voice, who firmly said, "You're going." I did not know how. Chicago to New Delhi is an expensive ticket, not to mention the cost of the retreat itself. And I felt like I had no business considering such an extravagant luxury. But from that moment, I could not stop thinking about going to India. Did I mention my business was failing and that I was nearly bankrupt? At that very moment, I was in the midst of a 3-year commercial lease on a studio space that I was also living in due to not being able to afford rent of my own. I was not paying myself. I was barely covering bills and payroll, or had I already started skipping utilities at that point? I was way overextended on credit cards, paying hundreds of dollars every month in interest. I was exhausted from trying to hustle. I was trying desperately to assuage my gnawing loneliness through a series of self-destructive online dating experiences. My self-esteem was in the gutter. Even my skin was revolting against me with a bout of cystic acne, the like of which I had not seen since my teenage years. And somehow, the thought of leaving it all behind for an adventure in a foreign land sounded like my only option for redemption. 2 months later, I miraculously stepped foot on the grounds of a gorgeous retreat house in the woods, just a short motor scooter ride away from Lakshman Jhula, a famous suspension bridge across the river Ganga, located 5 kilometers or 3 miles northeast of the bustling spiritual tourism hub of Rishikesh. I say miraculously because up to that point, I did not have a working cell phone, GPS, or any way of fully being prepared for how difficult navigating India or communicating basic things or staying safe as a solo, white, broke female traveler would be. There was actually one night back in New Delhi where, completely lost after dark, I actually made a tearful selfie video from the back of a tuk-tuk for people to find later in case I never made it back to my Airbnb. Clearly, I overcame these challenges to be welcomed by a group of strangers, mostly from LA, to the start of our 14-day retreat, 6 days here in Rishikesh, land of the Hindu deity Shiva, who represents the energy of death, destruction, releasing attachments, and ultimately transformation and rebirth, to be followed up with a long day of travel via bus to Vrindavan, flanked by the Yamuna River, childhood home of the god Krishna, who represents love, compassion, devotion, and play. From there, I would be continuing my solo travels south to Kerala, Mumbai, and finally Goa on the Arabian Sea. On our very first full day of retreat, a group of us were walking through the trees to hop on scooters that would take us across the monkey-ridden Lakshman Jhula Bridge into town, when I caught sight of a large, black, buzzing, flying creature. Too late. I felt a sharp stab through my pant leg. I cried out. Then fire started to spread throughout my thigh. One of the strangers I had just met told me to drop my pants so we could look at it. I did. A tiny pinprick with a faint red tinge around it. I decided it couldn't be that bad. I would suck it up and go into town with the group anyway. Maybe there would be a pharmacy with some antihistamine or at least a clue as to what had just stung me. There was a pharmacy. They sold me ointment. It did nothing. The poison spread, and by the end of the day, my thigh had swelled so much it was bulging the seams of my khaki capris. Back at the retreat house, another woman from LA offered to give me an energy healing session, which I gratefully accepted. She then told me that I had asked for this to happen and suggested I analyze my choices and behaviors to identify how I had brought this on myself so I could expunge the poison from my life. You can't actually see me rolling my eyes right now. I then consulted the retreat center concierge, Manoush. He handed me a business card for an Ayurvedic massage spa in town and said to go see his friend S, who ran the place. He also said that it was just a minor sting and not to worry. I would be fine in no time. The next day, back into town, only this time I could barely bend my knee to get on a scooter. It had swollen to the size of a very large grapefruit. Hobbling into the small, dingy storefront that matched the address on the business card, a brusque woman whisked me into the Seoul chilly treatment room and gave me a forceful, very oily massage, including pounding my leg with hot compresses. I felt pretty beaten up by the end of that session, and when I emerged from the massage room, she pointed to a bench in the tiny reception area and said, "Wait." So I sat. Moments later, a stocky man, 30-ish, strode in wearing mirrored sunglasses, his motorbike parked out front. S. He gave me one look from head to toe and started giving orders to his staff in Hindi. Before I knew it, my foot was soaking in a bucket filled with some kind of herbal remedy and salts while he kneeled on the floor with a soaked towel, repeatedly compressing my leg from mid-thigh down toward my ankle. A cup of steaming chai arrived from somewhere, a nearby cafe or chai stall perhaps, brought to me by one of the teenage boys who was hanging around the shop. S spoke to me in hesitant English. His voice was smooth and calming. He asked me casual questions about where I was from, the trip I was on, and I answered. At a certain point, as the water in the bucket was starting to cool, he said, "Acha," the standard Hindi for okay. He lifted my foot out of the bucket, told me to stand, examined his handiwork, and in a somewhat satisfied voice said, "Better." Honestly, it did not feel any better, but at least I felt taken care of. "You come back again tomorrow," S said. "No charge." And so I did. This time, my calf was so enlarged, I felt like it would explode. Another soak and compress from S. No super oily massage and pounding this time. During this soak session, I noticed how attractive S's smile was. I also noticed how these younger teenage boys in the community would hang around the shop and seemed to be at his beck and call for things like fetching us chai or preparing the foot soak or cleaning the massage room after a guest. True to his word, there was no charge for this soak, only this time he asked me if I wanted to have dinner at his friend's cafe. Strangely, I wanted to say yes, but it was already getting late. In fact, it was dark. My retreat friends had gone back to the guest house hours ago, and I thought they'd be worried if I didn't show up for dinner. Plus, I wasn't really sure what the norms were for a single woman to be hanging out in a cafe with an Indian man she had just met. I declined. So, S offered to give me a ride back to the guest house on his motorbike, which I gratefully accepted, saving me a $5 taxi fare and a long, painful walk to the actual cab stand. So we rode with my arms wrapped around this stranger's waist, frigid mountain wind in my hair, the smell of his leather jacket mixed with the Ayurvedic herbs on his skin. S told me to come back the next day. I wasn't sure. We had group plans, and honestly, I wasn't convinced this Ayurvedic foot soak was really doing anything. He made me promise I at least wouldn't leave Rishikesh without seeing him again and making sure that the poison had completely left. I promised. Later, when I relayed the story to the group over dinner, they all said I was crazy and I should have just gone out with him. And then they proceeded to tease me about the potential for having a foreign affair. Americans. Rishikesh Day 4, November 21st, my birthday. It turns out I couldn't go on the group waterfall tour because the massive swelling had settled into my ankle and foot. I could barely strap a sandal on. Against my better judgment, I decided to go to the spa late morning. S gave me yet another salt soak. I told him it was my birthday. He immediately stopped massaging my leg and told one of the teens to go do something. I thought maybe he'd be coming back with a chai. Instead, the kid came back and S told me to come with him. He had a surprise. We left the spa and walked down the street and up a narrow flight of stairs to this dimly lit, if I'm honest, kind of seedy restaurant with floor cushions and low tables, East West Cafe. We were warmly greeted. They obviously were friends with us, and we were shown to a private table near the back. Suddenly, all these plates of steaming food started to arrive. Dal makhani, chana masala, all delicious. And then, I couldn't believe it, a giant piece of chocolate cake with a fat, totally not birthday candle, someone with an acoustic guitar, and a small group of strangers singing happy birthday to me. I couldn't stop laughing. I was so happy. S would tell me later what a pain in the ass it had been to find chocolate cake on such short notice. But they had done it. At that birthday lunch, all the walls started to come down. S shared with me his backstory growing up in a poor family, struggling against the rigidity of the Indian caste system, sleeping on the streets at times, not having 2 rupees, the equivalent of 4 cents, that he needed to go to school. And yet, somehow, through his own resourcefulness, he made it through school, college, massage training, and now is a successful small business owner. I told him of my failing yoga studio in Chicago, how I didn't know what I was going to do when I got home. I felt like I was holding on for dear life. I hadn't really admitted this to very many people in my life. I was way too busy trying to keep up the facade of success, the facade that I had everything under control, the facade that I was independent and really didn't need any help. S told me not to worry. Actually, he said, no problem. Everything is possible. At first, I found that phrase infuriating, but it would become his mantra over the coming days, and it grew on me. Then we spent the rest of the afternoon brainstorming business ideas together over that huge piece of chocolate cake. Too soon, I had to go. Group dinner back at the retreat center. He asked me to come back tomorrow, but we had temple tours scheduled all day, and I felt guilty, like I was missing the entire retreat that I had signed up and paid for. Dinner, then? I said I'd think about it. It would be late. He said he'd wait for me at the spa. The next day on the temple tour, I was distracted. I was undecided. I was elated and nervous. I liked S, was attracted to him. Actually, I couldn't stop thinking about him. But what was the point of a date with someone you'd be leaving in just 2 days' time who lived halfway around the world? I mean, I didn't come here looking for a hookup or certainly not an Indian boyfriend. I confided my dilemma in one of my new retreat friends. Do you trust him? He asked me. Yeah, for some reason I did. Then fuck yeah, you should go have dinner with him. So I did. We returned to the East West Cafe at our same private table in the back, another delicious feast. This time, we sat next to each other instead of across the table. We kissed. It was awkward, not something you should do in public. So we went back to the spa. It was late. No one was around. I wasn't really sure what would happen next or what I wanted to happen next. Part of me felt like I needed to go. S told me to open the door to the treatment room. And when I did, I was greeted by the flickering of candlelight, fresh red rose petals sprinkled across the massage table, and a thermos of steamy chai with 2 clean cups was waiting for us. I panicked. Rose petals? One of his neighborhood teens must have set this up while we were at the restaurant. How embarrassing. And yet, this was the most romantic gesture anyone had possibly ever made for me. I immediately wanted to know what his expectations were. He said, nothing. Everything was up to me, whatever I wanted. So, I did what I wanted. I stayed the night in the spa. I know, weird, but he said that he was currently living with his parents while he was building his own house, so our options were limited. That night was awkward. and intimate and sweet. I felt like I was either living a perfect rom-com movie or the worst night of decision-making in my life. I cried silently while S slept beside me on a thin cushion on the cold tile floor. I was happy, but I was in over my head. I'm leaving tomorrow, I said at 5 a.m. the next morning as the sun was rising, my breath visible in the chill of the pre-dawn air. Other shopkeepers on the narrow street were just arriving to work. Don't continue on, he said. He told me to stay, that love was more important than visiting temples. Love? Really? Was that what this was? I told him I could not do that. I would be going to Vrindavan with the group as planned. I casually said, you could meet me in Goa in a couple weeks at the end of my trip. It was a throwaway, an impossible suggestion. Everything is possible, he said. His assistant arrived at that moment, and he had him drive me back to the guest house so that he could get the shop ready to open. Do you like him? The assistant asked me in English as we were slowly winding through town on the motorbike. My heart was in my throat. Before I had left the shop that morning, day 6, S had asked me to have dinner with him again on that one last night. I agreed, but made it clear that I couldn't stay late, certainly not overnight, and had to return to the guest house afterward. Our bus to Vrindavan would leave at 6 a.m. the next morning. When I walked into the open-air dining area at the guest house that morning, everyone was waking up to their morning chai. They were relieved to see me. They had known I was on a date, but hadn't really expected me not to come home. They teased me, asked me questions. I was in a daze. I hadn't slept. I hadn't been pursued, courted, wooed so intently and creatively and kindly by a man in maybe ever. I hadn't, in my wildest imagination, dreamed up a scenario like this when I was planning my escape from Chicago. I just wanted to chant some mantras on the bank of the Ganga River. I just wanted to practice yoga daily with my favorite teacher. I wanted to visit some sacred sites, learn about the culture from which the practices that had become so central to my life had come, and eat delicious food. The swelling in my leg was finally gone, and we were getting ready to leave. Was I out of my mind? That evening, S and I returned to East West Cafe one final time. We were somber. He asked me again to stay. I said no. He said, then it's decided. I will meet you in Goa. I laughed. It felt like a joke. Why would he travel 2 days by bus or train across the country to spend 4 days with some girl from the United States that he had just met, who had just told him what a disaster her life was, who was just going to leave the country in the end anyway? He was serious. How will we even find each other so far away? I challenged him. No problem, he said. Everything is possible. He made a call. And moments later, a kid arrived at the cafe with a paper bag. That's for you, S said. I opened it. A cell phone. Now, cell phones were difficult to acquire in India at that time. You had to give them your passport, and there was a waiting period. Your SIM card had to be registered. How will this work without a SIM card? I asked. He just smiled, and shortly, another kid arrived and handed him something. A SIM card, loaded with prepaid minutes. So we can find each other, he said. This felt very shady to me. I asked him why it was that everyone seems to be at his beck and call to do these things for him, like he was some kind of mafia boss or something. And he said that it was because he was like a king in the neighborhood. He got that status by listening to people, helping them with what they needed, and making opportunities. He said that everyone knows that they can rely on him. So whenever he needs something, it's done. And right now, this was what he needed. I did go to Vrindavan the next morning on an interminably long and treacherous bus ride, and it was like a whole new world. I missed S. We texted, talked on the phone a few times, but not too long. Those prepaid minutes would disappear fast. The retreat ended, and I went on to a guest house in Kerala where I was the only guest. I had daily abhyanga massage on the rooftop, homemade dosas, and fluffy idli with fresh coconut chutney, and the most delicious chai to date, my favorite breakfast of all time. I took Carnatic singing lessons. I visited the beach, more temples, shops. I met with an Ayurvedic doctor who gave me herbs and powders and potions, as well as dietary and yoga recommendations for my acne. Too much unexpressed fire, he said. From there, Mumbai, where I had the quirkiest of Airbnb stays, I met up with a musician friend of an acquaintance, wandered around the opulent modern architecture right next to the sprawling slums, fought loudly with my tuk-tuk drivers over the price, and tried not to think about how little time I had left in India. I was finally starting to feel at home, better than at home. And then Goa. I flew from Mumbai to Goa, my final destination. S said he would meet my flight. I think I was only 30% confident of that or less. I had been disappointed, stood up, ghosted many times before. And that was just for coffee or drinks down the street, not for 4 days in a beach hut that took 2 days to get to each way. I hadn't heard from S for over 24 hours. And when I got off the plane, I scanned the crowd. There he was, wearing those same mirrored sunglasses, a dozen roses in his hand, a smile spread across his face. My heart skipped a beat and I jumped into a giant hug. We had 4 beautiful days on the Arabian Sea ahead of us. It wasn't perfect. Goa, it turned out, was kind of trashy, riddled with drugs and alcohol, techno music, and scantily clad Russian tourists. But we made the best of it. And it was a relief to have S there with me. When we got to our hotel, and I was disappointed because they said there were no beach bungalows available, he chatted up the service staff and got them to clean one for us anyway. When we wanted to go to his friend's restaurant on another beach pretty far away, he found someone to rent us their scooter. When I had a migraine one night, he gently massaged my scalp and my face and held my hair while I threw up in the bathroom. We made friends with a shop owner on the beach. She painted henna on my hands, and he painted on my shoulder blade. She told me privately that he was a good and honest man, not to let him go, that I was lucky. We were vulnerable with each other. We fought. We learned where we didn't see eye to eye. We discovered we had more in common than may have seemed possible. We talked about business. We laughed. We goofed around. He taught me how to say I love you in Hindi. We cried. Especially the last day. He wanted me to extend my trip and come back to Rishikesh with him. I couldn't. I was out of money, and I had to face my reality back at home. We promised to call each other. I promised I'd come back. He promised to come to Chicago. At the time, we meant it. On the international flight, Royal Jordanian from Mumbai to Chicago, sitting across the aisle from the lavatory, I cried for 5 hours straight in front of a revolving door of passengers relieving themselves. The flight attendant directly asked me at one point if I was okay and brought me tissues. I felt I was leaving a piece of my heart in India. At the same time, I knew that I was bringing back something even more valuable in exchange. Thank you for listening to this very vulnerable and yet so important travel story in my life. I'd be curious to hear your feedback. And what are those experiences that were unexpectedly healing for you in your own life? You can email me voice feedback or written to andrea@thecreativeimposter.com, DM me on Instagram, or leave your comments about how this story lands with you in a review at ratethispodcast.com/creative. This episode was mixed by Edwin Ruiz. Our theme music is by Jovia Armstrong. I thank you so much for listening. I wish you the best of transitions into the new year. And this week, I am inviting you, if you should so dare, to examine a bittersweet memory that helped shape who you are today.